And he looked up to me and he said, circumspection. And I was like, what? And he said, circumspection. And I was like, okay, but why? And he's like, I should have thought about the consequences. I should have thought ahead of time that if I go in there and close the door, and then he didn't go into this much deep dive, I kind of helped him with it. I said, yeah, then everyone would have left the school and you would have been by yourself. And he's like, yes, So, but that would not have been a word that we would have taught at that age level, but somehow hearing it throughout the school day or hearing maybe an older sibling or somebody else talk about it, he caught it.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Making Every Class Catholic podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Brett Sockland. I'm delighted to be joined today by my co-worker in the vineyard of Catholic education. We run into each other all over North America. We didn't really know each other, but we found each other kind of on the speaking circuit. Sister Dominic Rasmussen of Openlight Media. Sister, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you, Brett. This is wonderful to have this time to have a conversation again. So thank you.
So we should probably tell the story of how we met in Chicago. We had been seeing each other on the stage or in the program at I don't even know how many places. I think the first time I saw you was you were a keynote at NCEA. Was it in Dallas?
Yeah, that's right. It was in Dallas. Yep.
Yeah. That's the first time I saw you. But then we just started running into each other, and I was coming into Chicago at night, and you were leaving the next morning.
Right.
And we said, okay, we actually have to sit down here and talk. So we went off to some meeting room in a retreat house and sat there for I don't even know how long, 2 hours, and sort of said, look at how much we're doing overlaps with each other. And then I went to visit you in Michigan, and we shot some video together that is now on your podcast, which is now way bigger than mine. You guys have blown up here in the last, I was talking to Paul the other day, you guys have blown up entirely because sisters, who can compete with sisters on TikTok? I mean,
right. No, who would have ever guessed? Yeah, it's just kind of hitting it at the right time. And it's done really well. We're really grateful. Yeah.
So why don't you start by telling us a little bit about your own history in Catholic education? You're now in an apostolate that serves Catholic educators, but of course you started yourself as most of the sisters in your order start as teachers.
Yeah, exactly. So my love for Catholic education goes back to, I started. So when I entered the Nashville Dominicans, obviously we know them as being wonderful Catholic educators. And that was, the first community that I lived in there in Nashville. And so I actually started teaching. My first year teaching was 1984 or 5. I can't remember. Because what we would do, we would go after a couple of years of college, we would go to one of the mission locations, and then they kind of throw us in the classroom or could throw us in there to get the experience, which was really wonderful because you have this firsthand experience of teaching, and then you go back and you're being exposed to a classroom and a school community, and that was in Birmingham, Alabama. Then I went to Belmont University, and it was Belmont College at the time. I got my teaching degree. And then from that point on, it was just different assignments where I taught. I taught for a period of time in Cincinnati, Virginia, back in Birmingham, and Jackson, Tennessee, and Memphis. So I had exposure to all parochial schools, which was wonderful, and taught everything from first grade to 8th grade. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that I was a great first grade teacher, but I love my students. So that's the first thing. They knew that I loved them and care about them, but that's not my strength. But it was good. I had great coworkers at the time. That was in Cincinnati. And then after that, it was probably all a total of about 12 or 15 years experience in Catholic education, teaching all subjects. And then when we began the Dominican Sisters of Mary Mother of the Eucharist here in Ann Arbor, Michigan, started in New York, came to Ann Arbor, we had this great opportunity where we could start our own schools. Tom Monahan, who founded Domino's Pizza, Ave Maria University, had a great love for Catholic education and wanted to make a difference in this local area. And so he really started using some of his funding for that and asked us to come and run the schools and we could start them. So we had this great privilege of building the architecture. We wanted daily mass. He wanted daily mass to be a part of every day. So each of the two schools that we have a chapel that's large enough to hold all the students. It's located in the center of the school. So, for me, it was really awesome to think that my students were every day walking past the chapel. And no matter what I arranged it, no matter where they did, if they went to lunch, if they went to PE, they're leaving school, coming to school, there was always some way they would just naturally walk past where the chapel was. And I even changed the flooring outside the chapel so that they knew they could tell something was different. And I guess the thing is, you think you talk about this a lot. We talk about this Catholic worldview or sacramental worldview, or how do we create that for kids in a school? And sometimes it's more of just the signs and symbols and walking by that, understanding it's a place of silence, but knowing that the day begins at that sacred moment with the holy sacrifice of the Mass, and they're nourished there on the body and blood of Christ, and it flows out. So that naturally just kind of flows into everything we're doing throughout the day. So I administered the school for about 20 years, or it was 20 years. And during that time, we, again, building the schools, we're able to bring our Dominican experience and our philosophy of education to the school, and which obviously would be Thomistic and Dominican and Eucharistic and Marian, but also this pursuit of truth, so that we look at the importance of a rigorous, challenging, more of a liberal arts education. This is why when you come and sit and talk with all of us, we just have conversations that could go for hours, right? Because we kind of see the world through the same lens. And so just building the curriculum, hiring the teachers. But then also what I began to notice is that there was a gap in really just virtue education. And I was asking my teachers, I was like, okay, we need to be intentional about this in the classroom. So finally and also we were starting to have situations of bullying or some sort of behavioral things. And so there's a pressure to bring in programs from the outside. And I was like, well, why would we do that if we have virtue and we can look at the history in our own church of saints who have been great educators, Elizabeth Ann Seton, St. John the Baptist de La Salle, St. John Bosco. We can look at their methodology or the way in which they interacted with youth or how they approach Catholic education and adapt that bring that into our own time. And so it's marrying, I have a great love for St. John Bosco, it's marrying that preventive system, but also bringing this understanding of virtue, the language of virtue, and the beautiful way that St. Thomas Aquinas handed this to us, this corpus of understanding the virtues and the virtuous life, handed that down to us. And it's so much a part of our Dominican tradition. Well, my teachers, even though they identified as believing Catholic Christians, we went to Mass every day, they didn't have that formation, the catechesis in virtue, because as in time, and you and I have talked about this, if we look at the past 50 or 60 years in education, as the sisters and the religious left the school, the virtue formation that we would have a part of our formation in religious life, that kind of fell out and left with them, and this gap got bigger and bigger. Now, what's important to say here, Brett, is that it's not to say that the laity is not virtuous, okay? Because as I tell them when I speak to them, oftentimes they're more virtuous, they're heroic in a certain sense, where, let's just take an example of my daily life. I wake up, I go to holy hour, I have morning prayer, I have Mass, I go to breakfast. I do all of those things in silence and in a spirit of recollection, right? I mean, as much as I'm able to bring you yourself, you're not going to have that luxury, right? A lay teacher is not going to have that luxury. They have to think about how they're going to get their household going. And there's so many things that they're doing that really their response to get ready for the school day from a natural way of looking at virtue, I would argue that it could be more, their patience is more virtuous than what mine would be, because they're having, only God can judge it, right? But there's just the vocabulary that may be lacking.
Right.
And an understanding of what it looks like and sounds like to be magnanimous. We may know a lot. I mean, a lot of Catholic teachers that are magnanimous, but they're not going to know what that word is. I
Right.
mean, it's just not a normal everyday word, right?
Well, and I'm actually very interested in vocabulary as a question, but I'm going to put it off for just a second because I want to invite you to finish a bit of a story, which is, so you're working as a school administrator, you're recognizing, okay, there's this, common human problem, right? Getting kids to behave well when they spend
Right.
time together. There are modern approaches of people in good faith trying to solve the thing and probably even getting some things right. But in a Catholic school, to say, we actually have a tradition of thinking about this that is worth tapping into. And so you get to that stage and you say, okay, we're going to do this. And then that leads, this is where I'll invite you to finish the story, that leads you eventually out of school administration and into the apostolate that you're currently running with Openlight Media. So can you tell us a
Right.
little bit about that? And then let's go after
Okay, back to
the...
the vocabulary. Yeah, thank you for bringing me back on track. It's because once I get going on it, I'll be thinking. But you're right. So what happened is that, again, trying to give the teachers this vocabulary, showing them how to do it, them asking, okay, we want to do this, sister, but we just don't know how, right? And I said, okay, that's fair enough. But we need to do this together because you're professional educators. I bring this understanding of theology and catechesis, and let's marry this together. So we developed all these resources that are very practical and intuitive. So we would show what a virtue like affability looks like and sounds like, and we give 6 or 7 different examples, and there's illustrations that go on this. So when we were doing this and having this conversation together as a faculty and staff, it began to take hold in the school. And then the sisters, because we're assigned to different places across the nation, they would kind of take these same practices and they took it to, in particular, one school where we teach in Sacramento, California. So they're doing this, they're introducing this into their school community, and the school changes. The culture starts to change. The children's behavior starts to change. They're starting to see that, as you said, we're tapping into what's a part of our Catholic faith. Well, that it rose to the level of the superintendent in the diocesan office. And at that time, it was Lincoln Snyder. And he was like, gosh, something's happening at this school. I want this for all my Catholic schools. So that's where this transition happened for me running the school here, to where this kind of grassroots way of seeing this impact. So really, in a certain way, it was being led by the fruit of living the virtuous life that it was being noticed. So the community at that time, Mother Sumpta, she's like, I really feel like we should just have you do this full time, you know? And so what happens is, if you in Catholic schools, and from my experience as being a principal, I think this is where those years of experience really helped me build this infrastructure that we have now, which has now become Openlight Media, is like, how do you bring something that's transformative to the culture in the personal lives of the students and the parents, and make it sustainable for that school community? Because oftentimes there's so much attrition because there's a lot of turnover with teachers, and it's hard to keep them. It's hard to make a living on a Catholic school salary here in the United States. So I started thinking, okay, well, we create the materials, and then I was watching other curriculum for other academic areas like math and science and language arts, where they were creating training videos. And so I was having my faculty and staff do all these training videos for all the other academic areas. I said, well, why not have training videos for virtue education? So we started producing the videos and then also modeling how it could be taught. And then it just started growing and growing. Then once you start having one need, then there's another need. And so that's how we've kind of into this, probably about in our 10th year since that time. Now we're probably in about over 800 schools that are using it. So it's the Lord's work. God gives the growth.
Right, right. Well, our experience, I mean, I'm not at the scale that Openlight Media is at, but the experience of like doing something and having people be like, yeah, this was the thing we were waiting on. We knew we should be doing it. We didn't have the tools or the vocabulary. We didn't know where to start. Like, that's a very common story. And then when you run into something like this, and it's a beautiful thing about the Catholic tradition is because it has this compelling, coherent vision of the human person, the questions that come up when you're dealing with human beings, they're going to come up all the time.
Right.
And we're going to be tempted by the newest, latest thing. And there are great things to learn. We're learning new things all the time. And we're going to talk about neuroscience a bit. But what's this? Every scribe from the kingdom of God goes into the storehouse and brings out what is old and what is new. Right. And it's easy for us to like get caught up with the newest thing and not say, well, what is our tradition? Because human beings in St. John Bosco's day or Thomas Aquinas's day or Jesus's day were human beings. And so the basic questions that they face are not going to change. And there's this incredible wisdom. So let's dive into a little bit of this, I mean, theoretical foundation for virtue education, but in relationship, I think, with contemporary science, but also contemporary approaches. So one of the things, you didn't name it by name yet, but a very common thing in schools, Catholic or otherwise, trying to deal with these questions is what is often called social emotional learning. And it can have this sense of like a fad. Anyone who's been in teaching for a few decades has seen these things come and go. But also, I mean, there's good and true things that this gets right. And then there are, and I should say, anything like this can be done well or done poorly, right? And so this is not I don't want to do this in too broad of strokes. But then there are also like gaps or blind spots. And virtue education is a way of picking up in some ways on what it gets right, but also filling in maybe some of the blind spots. So do you want to talk a little bit about the relationship between virtue education and social emotional learning and how they approach the same kind of problem, but where they're the same and where they're different?
Exactly. Yeah, that's a great question. So I can bring it together if we, as a context, if you're looking at the last 50, 60 years, when I talked about that chasm that happened, there's a vacuum, right? So because of the virtue education or this way of life that was in every Catholic school was moving out, human nature doesn't change, right? We just said that. So the children are still coming to school, and there may have been the assumption that they're going to learn this way. They're going to learn social skills. They're going to learn how to control their emotions. They're going to learn how to do all that stuff at home. And the home is thinking they need to be doing all that at school or whatever. It's who's going to be doing it, because the emotions and the needs for social skills and all these things, that's just a part of life, right? And the amazing thing is, so if you talk about, let's just take the social part. Well, we know from the neuroscience that the brain is a social organ and it develops in relationship. And the first thing that comes to my mind when I hear something like that, well, of course, we're created in God's image and likeness. God's image and likeness, who is Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, who is relationship. We're called to live in relationship with each person of the Trinity. All of this begins at our baptism. We're immersed into the life of the Trinity. Everything that we hold as a part of our Catholic faith, and just understanding, again, the sacramental life of things, and that's where we start. That's the core. So, and what is it? What is it that gives shape to the social part? Well, those are when we look at the virtues related to justice. What's fair? How do we treat people fairly? Or the cardinal virtues of justice, which kindness, generosity, sincerity, affability, fairness, loyalty, all these things that give shape to friendship, relationships. And Brett, I go back a little bit further to the understanding too. I don't want to get too theological on here, but I'm going to throw it in here, to the state of original holiness and justice, right before the fall. And that state of original holiness was Adam and Eve's relationship with the Father, with the Trinity. They lived in relationship. And then with justice, it was their relationship with each other, within themselves, and with creation. So what happens at the fall? Okay, everything is thrown into chaos. All right. And what is it we spend our life doing? All right. We spend our life healing this rupture that took place between our relationship with God, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. We spend our life in our relationships with other people, our struggles with ourselves and with creation. And when you look at the theological virtues, which are those virtues that are infused in us at baptism, which orient us to God, and the cardinal virtues are this horizontal level, or the human virtues that we have as we're interacting with other people and living life. Okay. So you could just take all of that and see this everything that's related to society, to community, to living with other people. You take the emotional part, and we know that we have our emotions, which we know in and of themselves are neutral, right? Okay. The virtues of temperance and fortitude are the virtues that help us to regulate our emotions. The Catechism says that the emotions and feelings are either going to be lifted up, taken up by the virtues, or they're going to be perverted by vice. And so that's kind of what the balance that we're hanging in. And we know that virtue is what enables us to live in the middle. It's the mean in the middle, that golden mean that we're seeking. Okay.
Right.
So when I can look at and again, I think, as you said, and I think this is where you and I are so much, we see things the same way. People who are trying to address this in Catholic schools or in schools are all coming at this with well intention. And because we care about the child, we have this view, this Christian anthropology view of the child. We see them as a child of God, the dignity of the human person. But I don't know, sometimes what's happened is that there's been other agendas or other ways that they're trying to reshape how things are done in schools, and they're using this social and emotional way as a way to get into that. Okay. And I think it's dangerous for Catholic schools, for Catholic education. So that's why I spent 2 or 3 years, Dr. Villa and I working with our sisters, that we've intentionally worked on creating a curriculum that is grounded in virtue, the understanding of living the virtuous life. It's grounded in solid neuroscience, because the neuroscience is what's behind CASTLE, which is the 5 core competencies. And there's good science behind that, but it's good science that kind of got off the rails a little bit,
Before we get back to today's episode, I want to tell you about my friends at Openlight Media. The Dominican Sisters of Mary Mother of the Eucharist, in addition to sending out sisters to help staff Catholic schools across North America, also have a great media apostolate, Openlight Media. They also produce great resources and programs for Catholic schools, including the first Catholic social and emotional learning program. It's called Raised in Grace. I've seen their program Education and Virtue in many Catholic schools across the nation doing great work, and they're developing work in catechetics and personal faith formation that you can find at openlightmedia.com. And don't forget to check out their hit podcast, Dominican Sisters Open Mic, which you can find anywhere you get your podcasts. So, well, tell me a little bit about what might be dangerous in certain approaches to social emotional learning. And let me just jump off of one thing that you said that struck me as and I hope it's a helpful lead into this. You talked about social skills, and I just reflected on my own upbringing, and I thought we thought about social skills as like more, they were not moral questions about personal formation. It was like, can you make friends, or can you like not end up like awkwardly left out or whatever? And it was viewed more as a coping mechanism for the fact that life is hard and some people are jerks, rather than becoming the kind of person God calls us to be. And I think when I think about the people who had social skill, like they could be cool at school, some of those people had like figured out a system for like being better than other people and talking in a way that they could protect themselves from the vicissitudes of like high school social drama. And then some of the people were people who like everyone liked because they wanted to be around that person.
Mm.
And it's two very different approaches. And I never conceptualized really until you were talking that like, okay, what do I want my kid to be? I want my kid to be cool in the sense of like being able to make friends and engage with other people, but not in the sense of like playing the game to win in the high school drama, but in the sense of like everyone wants to be around you because you make them feel seen, understood, related to. And then you start saying, well, what does it take to do that? Well, it's things like magnanimity, affability, these words that we barely even know what they mean. As soon as you find out what they mean, you're like, oh, I want to be that.
Right.
There's no one who hears what magnanimity is and says, I'd rather be a little less magnanimous. Everyone, and that's the thing about virtue. As soon as you know what it is, you want it. Nobody says, I'd rather be less affable than more. I'd rather be less courageous than more. I'd rather be less generous, less humble, less like patient. But I hadn't conceptualized it in terms of social skills. And I wonder if part of this, if social emotional learning can go off the rails, I wonder if part of it is that we conceptualize this just as a coping mechanism for dealing with life that is hard, rather than thinking about the skills and the habits and the virtues we need to develop to become happy people.
Right.
You know,
right.
Is that, yeah.
Exactly. Yes. So that's a really great question, because one of the things I did, I don't have an example of it here to show you, but I created this wheel where on the outside, I put the castle's 5 core competencies, and then I kind of like on each layer that came in, I showed the one-to-one correspondence with the cardinal virtues and that. And also I brought in Dr. Dan Siegel's brain fundamentals for a healthy mind. And so what I'm trying to show with that is like, all of these things are goods, right? But we need to start at the core of understanding that what is my true identity as a person is that I'm a person that's created in God's image and likeness. I've been immersed into the life of the Trinity. I've been infused with the virtues and the gifts, that my life starts there, and Christ is my rock foundation and not me, right? So the dangers that I talked about is just, if you stay with just the outside, is how am I self-managing my life? How am I self-aware? How am I? And we all know if we build our house on sand, it's going to crumble. It may, and that's kind of that what the example you were giving of these two types of kids. If they're trying to build it on what they perceive is acceptable, eventually at some point that house is going to collapse. I think Pope Benedict wrote so beautifully about this when he talked about like the beauty of the saints. What's so beautiful about the saints is the goodness, is the virtue, and goodness is something that's, attractive. And when God created man, he said, and man is very good. So, John Bosco talked about that. There's good and there's no bad boy. There's good in every person. And sometimes we have to look harder. The people we have the hardest finding the goodness in is in our own selves. We're our own worst critics. But all of these other things are built on sand, eventually, instead of the rock foundation of like, why I'm good, not because I'm good, but because God is good. I'm lovable because God first loved me.
There's a freedom that comes from not having to carry that weight. Yes. One of the things I think that can happen with, and this is anecdotal, maybe there's data on this, but I don't have access to it. I'm just going anecdotally. Teachers who have incorporated certain forms of social emotional learning and then regretted it have said that one of the things that can happen is it encourages rumination, right? So I have to develop this competency and I always have to ask questions and focus on my inner life in a way that there's just an incredible amount of weight. And if I have to talk about my feelings all the time, I mean, sometimes it's good to talk about your feelings. Like, I'm not against talking about your feelings, but there's a certain structure of talking about your feelings that is not just growth in self-awareness, but is like a kind of turn inward focus that can just lead you down a rabbit hole where that's all. And like the best solution is like, go outside, go for a walk, talk to your friends, like do something other than sit and think about how you feel, right?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And that's exactly what we did when we developed our curriculum, is that we give instructions on the brain and the nervous system, and the strategies we give are things that can lift you out of the spiraling of, because if you're not careful, it can lead to like a scrupulosity, even in the, and if you take one thing, one strategy that they talk about is like name it to tame it, right? So if you are experiencing an emotion or something that's starting to become overwhelming, let's name it. Let's talk about what it is, okay? And then we find a strategy to release it. Is that not what we do when we go to confession, right? We name our sins, we vocalize them, we receive forgiveness, right? And then we receive the grace, hopefully not to commit those same sins again. But we're seeking, that's the spiritual life, right? We're seeking to, with God's grace, to tame those, have this point of conversion away from those bad habits towards goodness.
Right. Yeah. One of the things that's really cool, and I'll ask you to share a story or two about this. You have one about a kid who got, or locked someone in a locker or something that, but just to set it up, I mean, one of the things that I find really interesting about your approach with virtue education is you're not shy about big words. And one of the things that we know from emotions is if you can label and understand your emotions, kids with richer vocabulary around, right? So to say you're sad is one thing, but to recognize that one kind of sad has to do with frustration and another has to do with disappointment or whatever, the more fine-grained your vocabulary is around your emotions, the healthier and the more strategies you can have for approaching them. And I think it's the same thing. If you know about magnanimity, you can, and you have examples of circumstances where people are magnanimous or not, then when those circumstances happen to you, you're more facile, you're more nimble to be able to be like, what would be the magnanimous thing to do? And there's something about the human person as the language using animal that like language shapes our approach to reality, right? I mean, this is even true in scripture with creation through words, right? Like words are actually foundational to human experience and the way we interpret the world around us. And so if we know what circumspection or affability are, we're actually more capable of recognizing what calls for them in the moment and being able to make the analysis and ideally it gets to the point where it's second nature. But of course we don't start there. We need to start with being able to recognize the situation and say, what does it call for? And vocabulary is actually really powerful for that. And social emotional learning knows that about emotional vocabulary. And I think as Catholics, we can say the same thing is true about virtue vocabulary. And that's one of the things I love is like, you break down the virtues into like 28 different sub-virtues and they apply in all the different. So talk to me a little bit about some of like, well, let's have some fun with words. Like what are some of the fun words that kids use when they're learning these virtues? And then practically, how does that help them in their approach to the situations they face every day?
I have a list here of all the ones. What we did is, what the beautiful thing Thomas Aquinas gave us is he took the cardinal virtues and then he called them daughter virtues, but I called them related because daughter would just sound kind of weird to the modern ear. But like let's take something like circumspection, right? So one of the questions we often get with working with schools is like, how do we bring this language into the school? What's age appropriate? What virtues do the first graders need to know or whatever? And it's interesting because we can break it down, and we have done it. You can break it down developmentally and say at these different ages, they need to be focusing more on these virtues. And you can do it according to the science. But kids really pick up on this, and they like learning big words.
They love it.
They like the challenge in second grade on how do you spell transubstantiation. I may not be able to spell another word, house or whatever is on my spelling list, but I can spell transubstantiation. They like the challenge, okay? But anyway, so I had this situation and how I would use the language of virtue if I had, because I always looked at discipline. I don't look at it as like putting them down. I always looked, discipline was one of my favorite things that I did as a principal because it was always an opportunity for growth. And so I can remember talking to this little boy who had closed himself up in the locker in the hallway. And I'm thinking, I mean, fortunately, thank goodness, somebody saw the door close, but it was like it was towards the end of the day, and a teacher, someone way down the hall, noticed that the locker door had closed, because otherwise he could have been in there for a long time until he started really rattling it. So I was made aware of it right away and opened the door, and he's like looking at me and he's coming out. And I'm thinking, my first reaction is, from an emotional reaction, is, do you realize what could have happened? But then I thought, okay, well, I've got this language of virtue. Maybe I think it was like in first grade or second grade at the time. So I said, okay, I can't remember his name. Let's just say his name is Tommy. I said, okay, Tommy, what should you have done differently in this situation? Is there any virtue or something that you've learned that would help shape their decision that maybe this wasn't the best idea? And so I was just looking for something like, well, I need to think first, because he was little. I wasn't even looking for a virtue word, right? But I was just like, what should you have done? And he looked up to me and he said, circumspection. And I was like, what? And he said, circumspection. And I was like, okay, but why? And he's like, I should have thought about the consequences. I should have thought ahead of time that if I go in there and close the door, and then he didn't go into this much deep dive, I kind of helped him with it. I said, yeah, then everyone would have left the school and you would have been by yourself. And he's like, yes. So, but that would not have been a word that we would have taught at that age level, but somehow hearing it throughout the school day, or hearing maybe an older sibling or somebody else talk about it, he caught it. So what that told me, and what it kind of told the teachers, is, as I use that as an example, it's like, we don't want to underestimate, one, how God can be working within there. We don't want to keep the bar low. We want to raise the bar and let them naturally respond to something that's above that. When you can teach prudence, I mean, sometimes we would think, well, should I teach prudence? Well, you can teach prudence to a kindergartner. What is prudence? Well, prudence is right reason and action. Well, I broke it down to 3 words. Really, when we want to, and adults even need to learn this. Like, if you can remember 3 things about prudence: pray, think, act. Okay. So if you pray, you just kind of ask God to help you, whatever you're doing. You need to think before you do something, and then you act. Because I said, when you've come to my office because you got in trouble, you've been sitting out there and you've been doing the opposite of pray, think, act. You're sitting out there and you're praying that you're not going to get in trouble. You're thinking about what you've done, and we need your actions. First of all, you act and you thought and you prayed you wouldn't get in trouble. You did the reverse. All I want you to do is just reverse the first and third thing. Okay.
Right.
So I may have confused the story, but that's the right order, Yeah.
Right. Well, okay, so you guys have produced a resource. I think it's called the Virtue Field Guide.
Yes.
Did I get
yes.
that? So we had that at our house, and one of the cool things, so it's got the breakdowns of different virtues and sub-virtues. And what the kids did is they cracked it open and they looked at these lists, and some of the words are familiar, and some of the words are like, we've seen them before, but we don't really know what they mean, so we need to look them up. And there were 1 or 2 that they had literally never heard. And the first thing they did is flip to the page of the virtue that they've never heard, right? And so that tells you something about kids' approach to these things. Like, they're not afraid of these. They want to know. But I'm going to tell you another story that I want to set you up to ask you a question about fun virtues. Because the kids looked at some of these and they're like, oh, I totally want to do that, and I never had a word for it before, and I've even forgotten the word. You're going to have to tell me. It's like
ultraphilia. I can never say it right. Ultraphilia. I always say it wrong, but that's what it is. It's ultraphilia. They always tease me about not saying it right, but yeah.
Is it eutropalia?
That's it.
Okay.
I always end up saying it wrong. Yep.
So we're going to come back to that, and you're going to tell us what that actually is. Yep. But here's my story. Gone to lots of schools, and lots of them are working on virtue, very often with help from your ministry. And the teachers and the students have got into a habit of asking the question about virtue. What virtue do you need for this circumstance or whatever? But one thing that I've noticed is there's like the lowest hanging fruit, the easiest answer, no matter what the teacher says, is the student will say perseverance. Like you always, it's always right, because math is hard, perseverance, or we have a test coming, perseverance, or we should keep practicing hard because we got a big game coming up, perseverance, right? And so like perseverance is like the one that in my experience, the students learn perseverance really quick because it's almost always the right answer. And that's good as far as it goes, but it can give the impression that virtue is mostly about doing hard things and like knuckling down. And there's an element of that, but it feels to me like that's the setup without the follow through. And when they realize that something like affability or magnanimity is like, they can picture not someone gritting their teeth and getting through something, but someone with like such a healthy attitude towards themselves and the world and the challenges that come, that they take things in stride and they make the people around them feel good while they're doing it. It's like, oh, that's actually the image that I want for my life, and perseverance is going to get me there. But so I just want to like focus on like, for a minute, like fun virtues to sort of counterbalance the sense that virtue is mostly about duty and gritting your teeth, when in fact we know from our Catholic tradition, virtue is really about joy.
Right.
Like the magnanimous person is the joyful person, as is the perseverant person.
Right.
You know, a person who gives up easily is not a joyful person. But to bring in some of these, and maybe we can start with eutropelia, but what are some of the fun ones?
Right. Yeah. So that one is that one lends itself to, it's related to temperance, right? So it leads to a moderate balance of life. And you look at what would the opposite of that be? Well, it's the person that is like always working or always studying or whatever. But the importance of, like, even if we look at the word recreation, that's supposed to be like recreate. Like in our life, in our religious life, we have a period of time every day where it's like an hour where we're just playing games or we're doing things. It's just like a healthy balance of life. And so with that, and it's being creative, it's playing a game, it's doing something that you enjoy. I mean, I think that's why people are so attractive about this understanding of like what's of leisure, to give yourself permission to enjoy something. It's okay. And to realize that it's virtuous is even better. Like it's okay. It's okay to go for a walk. Right. It's okay to.
It's more than okay.
Right. Yeah. Right. It's needed. It's necessary.
It's needed. You will not be a fulfilled human being the way God created you to be if you, and let me paraphrase eutropelia, if you're not capable of having a good time.
Right. Right.
Right. So it's almost the perfect antidote to the duty first attitude towards virtue that might come out with a focus on something like perseverance. Perseverance is absolutely an essential virtue, but it's not the opposite of something like eutropelia. We know that the virtues come together, right? If you get good at one, you tend to get better at the others, all things being equal, right? And a person who doesn't give up is also someone who knows how to have a good time.
Exactly. Yeah. And so another one that, talk about the fun ones. I mean, another one that, and we really struggled, if you take the virtue of magnificence, right? So if you take the true meaning of that, it's related to like a wealthy, if you go back, like a wealthy king or somebody, that has these riches and they're going to give them away. And in doing that, choosily giving these away, that there's a deep satisfaction and joy that comes in giving, right? And as the opposite of the person who's like putting everything in the stockpiling, which you need, that we see the joy. Well, when we took that, I talked to several Dominican theologians about this. I said, this is a virtue that I got to have because it's related to fortitude. I said, I'm not going to not have it on the list because children need to learn this. But I want to talk about this a little bit separate from financially, but just the gift of yourself, right? The self-donation, this giving. So actually, one of the saints I tied with magnificence was Mother Teresa, who didn't have a penny to give away, but she gave completely and utterly of herself to the poorest of the poor. And I think that's important for us to instill in the youth. And you can give examples of like every day you've got, bring it down to what your little world is like. Do you have this great little snack every day, that maybe one of your classmates may not have the means that your family has, and maybe you share that snack with one of your classmates one day.
Magnificence is a fun one. And I mean, it's closely related to what we often call just generosity, right?
Yeah,
That would be
right,
a more
right.
common language. But it's a great example to follow on what we were just talking about, because it is easy to conceptualize generosity in a duty bound way. I should give, I have enough, I should give. But but a certain duty bound approach to it actually takes away your own joy in giving. Whereas the thing about magnificence is it gives this sense of like, I am fulfilled by it, right? It's one thing to think of it as like, I can fulfill another and by losing something of myself. But there's
Right.
actually like, I am fulfilled by giving. And the language of magnificence portrays something of this. I've got,
Right. And you make the distinction is that like generosity is related to justice. I mean, where you give something that's fair. Magnificence is with fortitude and is the emotions of struggle, right? So you're giving to where it may be the struggle, like I'm going to, there's a certain level of courage that or faith that goes forth writing, or if it's someone, that can write a big check or whatever. So there's which one it relates to is how it's practiced and lived out, but it can kind of look the same. So that's kind of these are the fun discussions that you could have. And a lot of the discussions we had when we were putting together the list and putting together the examples and the definitions and all of this.
Right. And like my kids love it. Like they
Yeah.
love figuring out what words mean and how to use them very precisely. And like, even for me right now, like the distinction between generosity as under justice and magnificence as under fortitude actually helps me get a sense of what it feels like to be generous, which is similar but not the same as what it feels like to be
Yeah,
magnificent.
because like even if you like when you were talking about perseverance, I was thinking, this it's why I put it on the list, industriousness, because I said that's a word we need to bring back, right? And that's one that's related to fortitude. So what is with industriousness? It may look in some ways it may look like perseverance, but if you cultivate this virtue of industriousness, it's a steady way of working through something. One of the pictures that we used for that was the little kids shoveling the sidewalk with snow. Like he needs to be careful about doing that task, right? He could kind of grit through it, but so we were careful about the pictures and the way we explained it to the kids to have them show the examples, but they can look the same. But sometimes if you look at it differently, you're cultivating different habits or dispositions within yourself that rounds out who you are and becoming the person God's created you to be,
I love industriousness because it's so easy for us to think of work as like something that we have to do,
Yeah.
but that is like purely utilitarian. We just want to get it over with to get on with whatever else we're going to do. And industriousness like gives you a sense of joy in work.
Right.
I don't know if you know the short story by Tolkien, Leaf by Niggle. Does that ring a bell?
Yeah, no.
So I would recommend it to you and to all our listeners, Leaf by Niggle, but it's a story about purgatory. And the first thing Niggle has to do when he doesn't know it's purgatory yet, but when he gets there, is he has to do like menial tasks until he enjoys them.
Oh,
that's like his
interesting.
first step in purgatory is just like, and it's dark and like he just has to work and he doesn't really understand why until he can find like a kind of satisfaction in the work. And then he moves on to like the next thing. And it's a great story.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I love that. Yeah.
And shoveling snow made me think about that because I actually enjoy shoveling snow. There's something very satisfying about shoveling snow. It's the kind of work where your progress is so clear to you.
Right.
Like I'm done this strip of the driveway and now I'm going to go back and do this next strip of the driveway and I'm going to do this next strip and now I'm getting warm and I'm going to take off my jacket because I'm starting to sweat even though it's below freezing and all this kind of, and there's this sense of I'm fulfilling something that I'm made for in shoveling snow, right? And I think if you get that attitude towards any work that you're doing, then you're on the way to that virtue of industriousness, right? So I mean, okay, we could do this for a long time. Let me just point out that doing this is exactly the kind of thing that gives students the vocabulary and the felt sense of capacity that this is possible. Because one of
Right.
the beautiful things about virtue is there's a gradualness to our acquiring it.
Yes.
And we very often think of either I'm born with this capacity or not, or if I'm not born with it, I need to just will myself into doing something. And we all know, like, and this goes to neuroscience too, willpower is a limited resource.
Right.
You
Right.
can only will yourself to do something that you don't want to do for a very limited amount of time. And when you do it, you're depleted for the next thing you want to do. And the thing about virtue is it's not that you just do harder and harder things. It's that things get easier and easier.
Right.
Like when Pippin and Merry get back from their big adventure, they got to go to fight in great battles and face great enemies. They get back to the Shire at the end of The Lord of the Rings, and there's some ruffians who are causing some problems. And they're just like, I got this. It's just like this thing that 1 year earlier would have been completely overwhelming to them.
Right.
It's just like, okay, everyone follow me. Like, we got this under control, right?
That's a great example. Yeah.
And that's this beautiful thing about growth in virtue is you can literally feel it happening, and it stops feeling like I just need to will myself into being better,
Yeah.
or I just need to have been born a different person because
Yeah,
I'll never be good at it.
It's interesting you said that because when I was, again, developing this, I was real careful about the words. I didn't use the word practice, but I used the word cultivate because I wanted this understanding of like, we want to cultivate virtue, and that, I don't know, I just felt like it was a tie to tilling the soil, or and that, of course, now since I understand the neuroscience, is that really what's happening is neuroplasticity. You're literally wiring your mind towards goodness. The neurons that fire together wire together, but this cultivation and this interior disposition that's happening, it just seemed to me like this understanding of working with God is a response of grace. God's the one that gives the growth in this, and it's not all. We're not intended to white knuckle through life. It enables you to free your hands out,
I was just going to ask you to connect it with neuroscience. Because it's so much, right? We're even starting with learning the words is wiring your brain in a certain way.
Yes.
To be able to recognize certain patterns and respond in a certain way, right? And to be slightly theological here, it actually gives you more freedom, right? To wire your brain in this certain way and to take activities and just baby steps of wiring your brain in a certain way by telling good stories about virtues, by learning the language of virtues and making careful distinctions about virtues, by having an experience and having the principal or the teacher ask you to reflect upon which virtue you used in that circumstance, or if you didn't, which virtue you maybe should have used in that circumstance. All of that is wiring your brain, which makes the next challenge easier, and you can face it with more freedom rather than less.
Right. And to the point of the great work that you're doing, Brett, with making every class Catholic, once the teachers, you bring this language of virtue in this, and you're understanding it and how it's a part of who you are, understanding how you're helping them, you're educating them and how to cultivate it in their personal life. And it just becomes a part of who they are. They're going to take that to their friendships. They're going to take that to the literature that they're reading. They're going to take that. It's going to make them, once you learn this, we call it virtue spotting, right? Or whatever, but you come attuned to the behaviors and you see in other people. What also helps you it shapes your worldview too when you're reading literature or history, and it makes you more attuned to the people you encounter in history or in literature or science or whatever you're doing. So it shapes everything that you're doing in education, and what you're doing, the work you're doing is helping teachers recognize that. But virtue has to be a part of that language.
Right.
Yeah.
I've started calling them touchstones. There's various aspects of our tradition that teachers might tap into to find a Catholic connection with the curricular content.
Right.
And it's things like scripture and lives of the saints and the sacraments and all that kind of stuff. But virtues is like top tier in that because it literally shows up everywhere. Because in every discipline, there's the question of the human person and what they're getting up to here. And they can be doing it well or poorly. One of the great questions I've encountered, it was the first group that gave it to me was a group of science teachers in South Carolina working in their small group. And they said not simply what is the virtue that this, scientist had or whatever, but they said, what virtues are necessary to be a good scientist?
Right.
And that is like a completely transferable thing. You can say that about artist, athlete, writer, like whatever, like any subject you're doing. What virtues does math call forth from us, right? And not only perseverance is always the right answer, but it's not the only answer.
But in math, it'd be industriousness, right?
Industriousness.
Yeah, because if you don't learn your multiplication tables earlier on, you're not going to be able to be doing things a little bit later, on and on, yeah.
Right. And that really cracked open a door for a lot of teachers to think about, like, science is not just a thing that has practical utility, but it's the good practice of science is formative in virtue. Right. And being formed in certain virtues makes you better at the work of being a scientist. And once someone said that in one of my workshops, I was like, okay, I'm using that everywhere.
Right? Well, you think about it, that'd be a great first exercise to do for any class, to put that out there, have the teacher say, okay, what virtues are necessary to be a good writer?
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Even something like humility. I'm just thinking about writing, right? Something like humility. A good writer has to be willing to write something that's not their best and put it in front of someone else and get feedback.
And docility, to be docile.
Yeah. Right. Exactly. Okay. We could go on for far too long. Sister, I mentioned the field guide, which I recommend to parents and teachers. Yeah. Let's wrap up by giving you a chance to share a few of the resources that people can access through Openlight and where they can go to find out more about your ministry and other resources that they might want to look into for their work in Catholic education.
Yeah, thank you so much, Brett. So I think the first place would be start openlightmedia.com is the website. And then when you come to the website, you'll notice we have you have to go up, there's a store there so you can peruse and see all the different resources that we have for different grade levels. We really have 3 distinct programs. One is Education and Virtue, which is everything related to virtue from pre-K all the way until adults. There's everything that you need. There's video content to go with that. There's books. Then we have Race and Grace, Made for Wholeness, is what's focused on integrating the synergy between neuroscience and virtue, and also just understanding, in particular, interpersonal neurobiology. And really, we developed all of this out of necessity. One, because there wasn't a Catholic social emotional learning program out there for schools. And because of the need, the impact of the technology and the smartphone and the increase of anxiety and depression in students is just so important for, this could be a whole nother show, Brett, that we could talk about, but the importance for educators and adults to understand what's happening in the brains and the nervous system of our children and to help lead them to secure attachment. And the last program that we're currently starting to develop was what we call Remain in Me, which is directed towards a catechesis. We've got a great resource called Echoing the Mystery, which kind of breaks down the keys of 62 doctrines. That was a work done by Barbara Morgan, who started the Catechetical Institute at Franciscan University, and we did that in collaboration with her. But again, what we're really trying to do here is I'm taking my experience that I had as a teacher, as an administrator, and really kind of similar to what you're doing, Brett. We see it as coming in to be a support to teachers, to help develop these resources, to infuse into the school, the culture, help to shape the worldview, most especially to help with this understanding of their identity as who we are as a son and daughter of the Father, called to be saints. And so we have tons of videos in there, professional development, curriculum for children. And one other resource that we've also developed you can find on there is we call it the Torch app, which is on your phone. You can download on your phone for free. And we have a lot of free content on there. And one thing that's very special is the music that our sisters have produced about 10 years ago, where we're like Billboard #1 hits and things. All that music's on there for free, the rosary and such. So you can download that through Apple or Google Play. It's called Torch app.
Okay. Well, there's lots to explore at Openlight. If anyone is interested, I highly recommend it. And we've done a little work together. Like I said, I was on your podcast. Tell us the name of the podcast, by the way.
The podcast is Dominican Sisters Open Mic. It's an
Okay.
Openlight media thing. So it's OP and like Order of Preachers Mic, open mic. We kind of make a play on the word. Yep. And
Very
so
good. Okay. I'm sure some of
and,
us did not see the OP at the beginning of Open Light or Open Mic
right.
the way we were supposed to. So thank you for
Well, you
pointing that
would,
out.
yeah, and they can also find that great interview that we did with Dr. Villa. That was one of the first ones we released on those, so that's out there available. Yeah,
Right. Yes, we
yes,
did one with Dr. Villa that I think was episode 1
it
before
was.
you guys exploded. I am
Yes,
not
right.
responsible for your explosion. But I talked to Paul the other day, and there's another one that you
Coming
guys still
out.
have in the can that's coming out. I'm not sure if it'll come out before the one we're recording right now or after,
Okay.
but sometime late spring or early summer was my understanding. So
Right.
keep your eyes open for that. And who knows what else Making Every Class Catholic and Open Light might get up to down the road. I hope to come back to Michigan and visit you all soon. Actually, I told my daughter I want to bring her, that she needs to come see the
Nice.
Mother House.
That'd be
So,
great.
Sister John Dominic, thank you so much for
Yes.
joining us today, and God bless you and all our listeners.
God bless you too. Thank you.